Good morning. I'm Annalee Rugg. I'm coming to you from UCLA in Los Angeles, where it actually rained a little bit for the first time in months. And I'm very pleased to be here to introduce our inaugural webinar for the UC Women in IT Committee, which is a system-wide initiative to support women in technology. I'm also the Director and Humanities CIO at UCLA Humanities Technology when I'm not doing exciting things like this. And today's webinar, we're excited to have Ann Kovalchick, CIO at UC Merced, who will be giving a talk today. I can go back to the title, The First Woman Man, Gender Labels and Workplace Expectations. And Ann is a longtime mover and shaker in many realms, including in the women in technology community in the UC system. And so we're very privileged to have her kick off what we hope will be an exciting series of events, including future webinars and other events that we hope to sponsor. Ann, I have her bio. I wanted to share a little bit about her bio. Ann is actually Associate Vice Chancellor and CIO at Merced. Her work has focused on building capacity that ensures information technologies support the university mission. She has a PhD in instructional design from the University of Virginia and an MA in public anthropology from American University. And her professional interests include ethnographic methods, human systems design, and theories of sense making. And I think some of those things probably inform what she has to say today as well. She previously served as CIO at Drake University, Deputy CIO at Tulane University, and Director of Academic Computing at Ohio University. Before I hand over to Ann, I just wanted to share that we will be doing Q&A in the chat in Zoom. So as you have questions, feel free to post there. And Allison Flick at UC San Diego will be moderating that and gathering the questions, which we will handle at the end. So you're all muted until then, but you can be unmuted in the chat. And I also, the slide does share our UC Women in IT mission, which I wanted to emphasize, as called out in the bold typeset here, promotes a supportive, inclusive environment to advance the professional goals and aspirations of UC Women in Technology. And so we're really glad to have every single one of you on this webinar, and we encourage you to share the recording of this with others so that you can help us in that mission. Lastly, on the bottom of this slide, you'll see there is a Women in Tech channel on the UC Tech Slack team space or workspace. Please follow us there. That's a public space that anyone can join in the UC Tech Slack environment. And we also have a live, newly launched website, and the URL for that is at the bottom of this slide as well. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Ann, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Annalee. Let me get my slides up here. Okay, all right. So I'm assuming you can hear me and see the slides. Thank you again for that welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to be the first speaker of the series, of the Women in Tech series. And thinking about what I wanted to talk about, this idea of firstness really surfaced for me as a topic of discussion because we hear that term used so frequently. So I want to cover today some of the labels that we use to talk about women, particularly those that sometimes propel us or impede us from being in a first position, or that create expectations for us when we're in a position of being the first woman, whatever. And I want to add here that much of what I'm going to talk about is equally applicable to individuals from marginalized community, people of color, LGBTQ communities, and so forth. This is really kind of a predicament, being designated the first whatever, because in that role, there seems to be so many expectations and assumptions telegraphed by that label. And, oops, let me go back. Yeah. So, you know, one of the challenges here of being a first is that you're also an only, and as an only, you stand out. Everything you do stands out and is notable, and you appear to represent everybody in your group, and you have a burden of sort of demonstrating a collective of people based on your behavior or performance or competence. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how we talk about women, especially when they demonstrate competence, when they use their power, when they assert their expertise. And this idea of firstness sort of sends a mixed message, because there's a sense of accomplishment there, but then there's also often a doubt raised, and I think we see this, for example, in our political landscape, issues around whether a woman is electable, or her behavior, whether that improves her electability or not, or how she dresses, and so forth. I want to play a clip here by this choreographer, Twyla Clark. There is a closed caption version at the URL I have on here, and I'll share these slides later. I wasn't able to capture that version, and I've provided the timestamp if one wants to go back and read it carefully. But let me go ahead and play this first.
Everything.
There was a profile in the Times that says, I'm quoting, Ms. Stark remains among the very few female choreographers to have had a lasting influence on ballet.
Why don't they say one of the few short choreographers to have an influence on the ballet? The female nomenclature is highly abusive, it's ghettoizing, and it's irrelevant to what I've done.
You don't want to hear it at all.
I'm not interested.
Yeah.
I'm a worker. I'm an artist. I make dances. End of story. Judge me with the best. Don't judge me with the best women.
So, I think this clip really captures the problem I want to highlight today, and that is the way in which we judge women, particularly in this situation where they may be the first. And this is an intractable problem. In September, Forbes released their list of America's 100 most innovative men, and were quickly on their back foot when many noticed that there was only one woman listed on that list in position 75, I believe. And this really revealed kind of a flawed methodology, because women represent only about 5% of leadership in S&P 500, and then the methodologies they use further skewed the pool to reduce the likelihood that women would be identified. The World Economic Forum report from 2018, they do a gender gap report, has determined that it's going to take about 165 years in North America for women to achieve parity with men in 4 dimensions: economic participation, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. So this is very much a structural issue here. But 165 years is fewer than the number of years it's going to take to close the gender pay gap. Currently, women are paid at about 80 to 85% of what men are paid, and those gains were largely made in the 80s and 90s. That has pretty much stagnated. And the problem here, what makes it so intractable, is that this starts early. 67% of men will receive a pay raise in their first 3 years of employment, compared to 56% of women. And by age 30, men are about 8% more likely to be managers and 22% more likely to reach senior management. So the problem is women being promoted and achieving at the same rate. Some of you may remember, it was about 20, 30 years ago that regulators started calling for female test crash dummies. And in 1996, automakers began to petition for one, and it was in 2003 that the National Highway Safety Administration actually put a female crash dummy in a car and began to run tests. But it was just this year, 2019, the University of Virginia study from the Center for Applied Biometrics or Biomechanics found that women still have a 73% greater chance of being severely injured in a crash. And that's because the crash test dummies that were used were scaled down versions of the male dummy. So they were not anatomically correct. And further, they were scaled down to represent what is essentially 5% of women size-wise based on 1970 norms, which is about the size of a 13 or 12-year-old child. The dummies that were designed were 5 feet tall and weighed 110 pounds, whereas the average woman is about 5 feet 4 and 170 pounds. So, you know, again, and largely women, female crash test dummies are placed in the passenger seat rather than the driver's seat, despite the fact that women nearly represent over 50% of the drivers in the US. So, you know, even when we're dummies, we're not represented correctly. And again, I think this sort of shows that the reference point tends to largely be one based on males. So if any of you were at the EDUCAUSE meeting in October, there was a presentation around women and minority in technology and a poll of the audience taken, and you can see the results here. And what I wanted to do was launch that poll, same poll here for this audience, and see sort of how we compare. So let me do that. Okay, so you should be seeing a poll in front of you, and if maybe we can take 30 minutes or so and answer this question: what have you experienced or witnessed in your tech career? You can pick as many of these as you want. Let's just sort of see. Okay, so being interrupted, I'm just kind of looking on the fly here where some of our responses are. We've got, I'll take another 15 seconds or so because we've got about half of you voted. I know many of you are in group rooms. Okay. So similar to what the EDUCAUSE audience revealed, it looks like the greatest number of our community is being interrupted, being talked over in a meeting. Okay, being ignored in a meeting, equally high. It's interesting. It's very similar findings. Okay. So I think that shows, you know, how broadly experienced, how broadly we experience and share many of these common conditions that we face as women in the workplace. Okay, let's talk about some of the labels. Women are frequently labeled in terms of their performance. And I think most perniciously, there's a lot of data demonstrating that men are evaluated on their potential, whereas women tend to be evaluated on their past performance. And so they are always in a state of having to prove that they can accomplish or meet expectations. There's data based on a study done by a professor at the Oregon Health and Sciences University showing that female academics have disproportionately fewer Twitter followers, likes, and retweets than male counterparts. And she concludes that this really reflects the same power dynamics you see in real life, that lacking information, background information around competence and expertise, men by default will be rated as more competent. And part of the problem here is that there are a lot of myths and false narratives about the difference between men and women in important and non-biological ways. You know, there's a lot of myths about women being poor negotiators, being risk adverse, lacking fire in the belly, being overly sensitive. But the problem often is that the appearance that women lack confidence may result from the fact that women are not noticed when they speak up. They are ignored until a man restates the idea. Or that women are poor negotiators just may result from the fact that women often don't have access the information networks needed in order to be a strong and successful negotiator. So women's mistakes tend to be scrutinized and their failure heightened much more easily and much more frequently than is the case for men. And in response, we've seen a number of movements. There's an increased awareness about imposter syndrome. The lean in movement suggests that women should be more present and push and ambitious and so forth. And these are all helpful, but there's a risk here that suggests that it's women whose behavior should change, when in fact some of these problems, as I said, are structural and systemic. Imposter syndrome tends to grow out of a sense that women often aren't provided sufficient feedback. They're not given feedback frequently enough, informally, and then formally when it is provided, if it's critical, there is no contact because there's not been frequent feedback. And so it may come as a surprise. Therefore, women are less able to assess their strengths and weaknesses, and that engenders a kind of lack of confidence. Lean in is a response to believe that women are risk adverse. Well, if being smart is considered a winnable behavior, there is less incentive to make mistakes and take risks. And if you're constantly being critiqued for your failed ideas, then yes, it's very sensible to sort of sit back and not lean in. And this often leads to efforts to fix or accommodate differences. For example, women are often encouraged, if not expected, to ratchet back their work or given less challenging assignments when they are mothers, when that same is rarely afforded to men. So I think it's important to think about what the expectation is around who is supposed to be changing their behavior. The other problem here, women are often labeled in terms of their behavior. So, women who demonstrate power are often not considered likable. This is called the abrasiveness trap, and very common among high achieving women. Women tend to bear a much greater social penalty for demonstrating behaviors that correlate to successful outcomes. So for example, direct communication, driving teams towards goal completion, decisive action, expressions of winning. These are all considered ways in which when men behave in these ways, it's effective, but women risk being told they're being unlikable or too abrasive. Common labels of being too opinionated, being too aggressive, that they are ice queens or the evocative ball buster. All of these examples of women whose behavior is identified negatively in cases where they're actually reaching some state of some achievement or performing in ways that would be considered effective or winning in terms of male behavior. But I would also say that there is, women can do this to each other as well. Women are equally guilty of sometimes using these terms. This is a documented problem experienced by senior female leaders who provide constructive feedback to younger women, who often refer to them as functioning as the queen bee. It's called the queen bee syndrome. The same behavior among and between women, they can refer to each other as being catty or being bitchy. And this is sometimes in contrast to an expectation of them being motherly. And this creates a kind of self-imposed bind where nurturing behavior is unnoticed because it's expected. And then when the feedback reveals a slight bit of criticism, one is termed a queen bee or behaving with jealousy, because it always seems worse to get criticism from someone within your group or who is a supposed ally. The operating assumption here is often that this results from functioning successfully in a male-dominated workplace, and that in a more egalitarian workplace, these women would revert to being softer or more comforting style. But then this further constrains the space in which women leaders can operate, and again is a focus on their behavior. And then women are also labeled by how they look. Renee Englund wrote this book, Beauty Sick, several years ago, in which she talks about the extraordinary amount of resources that women spend on making sure that they look a certain way. So time and money and worrying about how they look. And this is very much a learned behavior. She cites a statistic in which I think 35% of 5-year-olds have been on a diet at one time. So this idea of dieting and of always appearing to meet a particular standard is all driven by the fact that men have been shown to place a higher value on physical attributes. But there's also kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't phenomena here. There's researchers out of Washington State University and University of Colorado that have shown that beautiful women, women who look a little bit more like the kind of classic standard of aesthetic beauty, are perceived to be less truthful, less trustworthy as leaders, and more deserving of termination than their more ordinary female counterparts. And this really feeds into this male trope of the evil seductress or the femme fatale. So again, you know, the focus here is, and the associations here are really focused on how women look, and the labels are aligned to that. And, you know, an extraordinary example of this that is all too contemporary is a recent controversy around Ernst & Young, who recently sponsored a seminar or a series of annual seminars on leadership for women, training their female executives, that promoted these extraordinary sexist views, you know, advised women to manicure their nails and to wear, you know, fitting attire and avoid certain types of necklines, and, you know, to demonstrate female and more feminine traits such as cheerfulness, to smile more often, and told them that ambition and assertiveness were masculine behaviors. And this extraordinary quote that, you know, men's brains are more like waffles and so somehow retain information. As I said, I'll share these slides, and there is a recent clip from early November in which the chair and managing partner of Ernst & Young, you know, attempted to respond to some of the outcry. And you can see that, you know, this was a very controversial event within the company that went on for many years until finally women spoke up. And they have suspended this program since then. But I think, you know, you see the score sheet on the slide here, suggesting how women should score themselves. And it's just amazing to me that, you know, in 2019, this kind of stuff is still going on. But I think that speaks to the fact that women have also been often labeled by the work that they do. There's a long history of women's work being devalued. Marie Hicks, who was a former Unix administrator, became a historian. She documents the decline of women in technologies in Britain. And then Clive Thompson in the book Coders, which is an excellent book, describes in several chapters in this book the challenges that women in Silicon Valley face, and the sort of belief that women are not innately skilled for hard coding, or they'd already be hired at the top jobs. Again, you know, neglecting to see some of the systemic factors. You know, and there's also the expectation that women will do the office housework. You know, they tend to be the ones who volunteer to do the things like the parties and the note-taking. And I want to be clear here that there are often jobs in an office environment where that is the job. You know, I have a fabulous executive assistant who is excellent at doing this kind of work. That's part of that job. In cases where that is not a specifically assigned task, it's in those instances where women often end up volunteering to do these things or are expected to. And the problem here is that these are often tasks that are important, but they're not the tasks that create the promotion. They're tasks that benefit the organization, but not the individual's career advancement. You know, and this kind of leads to thinking, you know, there's a lot going on about how do we get more women in the pipeline. And there's a number of excellent things in the last, you know, 5-10 years that have been going on in this regard, introducing women at an early age to traditionally male domains, giving them peers and mentors and so forth. And there's been some modest success as well in terms of breaking through the glass ceiling. There's been C-suite gains of like 17 to 21% in the last 5 years. But I don't, I'm wondering whether the broken pipeline and glass ceiling metaphors are correct, and maybe we need to start addressing what's called the broken rung problem. And that is that, again, you can stuff people into the pipeline, as Marie Hicks suggests here, but if you don't promote them, if you don't address them and the needs that they have at that junior level, or recognize the biases that prevent women from promoting, then you're still going to have a problem solving this, really getting people through and into senior and leadership roles. And again, I think examples of this is there tends to be less unconscious bias training at entry levels. We increasingly hear about this, but at the junior level where it would really have an impact is not an area where we often emphasize raising awareness around some of the unconscious bias that prevent women from advancing. And again, as I said earlier, women get less frequent, less informal and lower quality feedback. And so they are less equipped then to assess their strengths. They can't account for their weaknesses. They therefore can't judge their prospects. And then that impacts their confidence. And of course, this is going to be a much more significant challenge for women who are young in their careers or junior and just learning. And then you have, some incredible bad backlash structural attitudes towards women that we've seen arise in the last few years. I think when you have instances where adults are attacking young teenage girls, this is kind of beyond the pale. But you also see this as a backlash to the Me Too movement, and a lot of this instantiated in the bro culture that grows out of the tech industry. Dana Boyd, who is a partner researcher, does a lot of social media and technology scholarship and research, wrote a fabulous, actually she gave a fabulous speech when she won the 2019 Barlow Pioneer Award. And the link on this slide will take you to both a written version of her speech, but there's also an audio clip. But she talks about the Great Reckoning. And in this speech, and accepting this award, she asks for a moment of silence out of respect for women who have been raped and trafficked, harassed, and abused, and points out that there is a way in which even women who now have achieved great things, such as herself, that we've done so in partnership with many others who have perpetuated the inequalities that exist and the injustices. She says, "I'm here today in no small part because I benefited from the generosity of men who tolerated and in effect enabled unethical, immoral, and criminal men. I'm here today because I learned how to survive and thrive in a man's world, to use my tongue wisely, watch my back, and dodge bullets. I'm being honored because I figured out how to remove a few bricks in those fortified walls so that others can look in, but this isn't enough." And I think her main point here is to remind us that these problems are systemic, particularly within the tech industry, and that we all have to consider how and when we are complicit and be sure to take action. That taking action is really the thing that's going to make a difference. So because the research is so contradictory and because we all have a role to play, I kind of mocked up this matrix here that I thought might be helpful to think about how we respond to labels. I would suggest that we aim for the upper right-hand corner, that we think about and be sure to use labels that highlight outcomes and achievements as opposed to the opposite, that lower left-hand corner where you really see the misogyny and the hate. The other two quadrants that are a little bit iffy, there are certain industries and contexts and environments where one's looks, are critical in the fashion industry, the entertainment industry. That is perhaps an outcome. How you criticize and provide helpful and constructive feedback on outcomes and performance, is often context dependent. So I put together this matrix to kind of help identify the different polarities that can exist in the labels that we use, and really to make a distinction between those labels that tend to focus on body parts and behavior, and hopefully focus more on outcomes and achievements. And then, there's a lot of things that we can do. There's some things that men can do that I think are really key. Recognize the structural barriers. Really keep an eye open for when they pop up and when they impede, and to use their positions of power to drive change, and to really make a difference, and to adopt an inquisitive and evidence-based approach. If you see women not speaking up, or if you see them being critiqued aggressively for mistakes, really ask them how they feel, ask them how you can help, and really taking the time to be curious and understand their experience. There's also things that women can do. Embrace your ownliness, appreciate the fact that you're unique and anchor yourself in those strengths. Seek and accept direct and specific feedback. I think because our mistakes are often highlighted and emphasized and scrutinized, we tend not to want to seek feedback because it's so high stakes. But I think you just have to plunge forward and do that. Track your success. Keep a journal, keep an email folder of all your positive feedback, so that when you have those moments of doubt, you can go and sort of remind yourself. Definitely say no to office housework. Just don't worry about it. Don't do it. Or develop a rotating system within your office that provides a way to distribute and fairly allocate those things. And find a cohort. Some examples up here, there's Women in Technology and the Anita Borg Foundation. But then there's things that are domain specific. Women Also Know Stuff is a group of expert women scholars in political science. Women Also Know History, again, experts, academics who study history. The Guild Academy, a group of female entrepreneurs and innovators. So finding a cohort is really essential. There's also things that we can both do together. We can position each other for success that will lead to higher level achievement. So men can help women promote each other, and women can help women promote each other. Build networks and invite participants into those networks. I think this is really critical because, again, women tend to be outside or not have access to networks. So being very explicit about building a network so that women have access to information needed to advance and succeed. Focus on excellence, not perfection. Recognize that there's going to be mistakes made and you're going to have things to learn, but keep striving. And then I think holding each other accountable is really critical. I put links here to two interesting apps. The Gender Avenger is an app that you can use at a conference and so forth to really identify who is in, what is the proportion of male to female participants, say, on a panel. And then Look Who's Talking is an app you can use to track who dominates in a conversation. So some things like this are fun ways to really kind of identify empirically some of the structural challenges that women face. I want to end with this little video. Let me go ahead and just start that.
And plie, and dance plie to your left, plie, time to. All right. And let's go. And down. And close first. Good. Right around your partner. Go to the front of dad. And plie. Lift up and swim around. And down. Good job.
So I thought that was such a wonderful clip because, you know, the story behind this is the challenge it was to bring these fathers into ballet class with their daughters. And, you know, it was for them a first experience because, you know, men don't dance ballet. And I think this shows that, you know, this idea of first is best when it's shared, when everyone's sort of recognizing the firstness of the experience and the burden isn't on the female, but that, you know, if we're going to charge to these first, it's something that's best when shared, and everyone should experience it. So I'm going to close with this slide. There is a link here, information on the UC Women in Technology. There is a Slack channel, if you're not aware of it, that you can join. And I also threw up here, because I just saw it yesterday, there is a seminar coming up on the 5th of December with EDUCAUSE Live that specifically looks at women in IT. And I thought that might be something relevant to folks in the audience. So happy to take any questions or follow up on anything.
Thank you so much, Ann. This is Allison Fleck at UC San Diego. I just wanted to thank you for this fantastic webinar and share a couple questions that people were sharing with me. The first one was, as a leading woman in IT, has your experience of being a woman in IT evolved or changed? And if so, any advice for how we should prepare ourselves as we rise to leadership?
I don't think my experience has changed so much. You know, and again, I'd say that's because in an environment where I feel that my biggest challenge in being a woman in this field is structural as opposed to, you know, personal. Those structural impediments, you know, are everywhere. You know, some of the things I've done is, you know, you pick your battles. You know, there have been experience or you know, things that have happened that I know clearly reflect an unconscious bias. And if I were trying to battle each one, you know, I wouldn't be able to do my job. But there are some where I've had to say to men, some of who are in power, you know, remind them, well, no, actually, that wasn't his idea, that was my idea. And it's a little hard to do that. I mean, you're self-conscious because it sounds a little bit like, you know, all I care about is getting the credit. But I've done that. I think to be silent certainly doesn't serve women, and it also reinforces, you know, a pattern that I think perpetuates the challenges we face. So I think you have to pick some times when you're going to be willing to kind of stand up, but you have to be careful, you know, I think not necessarily to become obsessed with, you know, winning the war necessarily.
That's, yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more questions. Why do you think some women hold other women down, and how do we best deal with it when we see or experience it?
Yeah, again, I think it's because it's sort of like, you know, you feel like someone is supposed to be an ally, and so you kind of have higher expectations for them. And I think that's a mistaken assumption. It shouldn't be, you know, women shouldn't be expected to be more egalitarian than men. I mean, that's unfair to women. But it's easier because we believe that there is this alliance, unspoken alliance. And so, you know, I think the first step is, you know, to be equal in your expectation that people are helpful and supportive of each other. When that happens, you know, as in most any conflict, I think the best thing is simply to voice the concern in a way that is constructive. You know, explain how you feel, why you feel that way, what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, and know that even when you do that, you know, the other person in the conversation may or may not, you know, be able to step up to have the same degree of honesty or engagement. And you know, and if that's the case, you just move on. But you know, I think not saying anything, it's so easy to assume or to conclude and attribute, you know, assumptions based on behavior experiences when you've really got to voice them, as difficult as they are.
And I have another question here. What are ways we can change the culture of feedback at our campuses? This is something that you definitely touched on. And I'm also curious, how have you changed feedback in the way that it's given at UC Merced?
Mm-hmm. I think you have to be aware that there's usually a formal process. So, you know, our annual performance management process, and then there's usually informal processes, and you need to use both of those. But you need to do them in ways that are linked. I think being more frequent, you know, and being concrete is important. And you need to really think about, you know, one of the tricky things here, one of the things that, to answer your second part of your question, one of the things I've tried to do personally and how I lead and give feedback is, it's easy to think, because we all are conscious of wanting to be egalitarian, that you treat everybody the same. But that's not the case. You can't manage everybody the same. People are different. And so some people need feedback of a certain type with a certain degree of specificity, or a certain frequency, or with certain kinds of concrete examples. And other people, you know, might need less feedback, or more, you know, more conceptual than concrete, or they might need more time to process things. So I think when you give people feedback, you have to think about how that person is likely to receive the information in a way that is most constructive. The other thing that I've found, and I think this is something it's not easy to do broadly because it's expensive, but where possible, to offer people kind of executive coaching or some third party, access to third party feedback, because when I'm working with folks and I give them feedback, they often need to process it with someone else. And so, you know, creating a culture of feedback where people are giving 360 feedback, or feedback from outside the organization, or feedback from professional coaches, I think then creates a richer body of feedback that benefits everyone.
That's really helpful, and something that we could all take back to our campuses to keep in mind too. So a couple more here. What is one thing I could do to make a positive impact on gender equality or equality in general in my department or on our campuses?
I think, you know, I would think about some of the things that we identified in the poll that are common experiences among, did I do that? Sorry, let me just, actually, while I'm here, I'll just go back to that slide. Some of the things here, you know, in terms that people have experienced, you know, being interrupted, talked over in a meeting, being ignored, mansplaining, taking credit for an idea, you know, when these things happen, you know, call them out. Now, you know, we have to be conscientious of not exacerbating the call-out culture either, and it depends on how they happen and who's involved. So there takes some judgment here. But, you know, I think being a little bit more conscientious in meeting environments or in environments where there's some dialogue and decision making about who's being paid attention to and who is not, and how to support those minority viewpoints in ways that are constructive. Similarly, if you have individuals who are in a junior role and so just may not have the experience to speak up and so forth, ask, what can I do to help you get where you want to go? What experiences are you looking for? What information do you need? Because I think when you're in a junior position, it's very, you don't know what you don't know, and yet you have a feeling you don't know some things. And having someone come in and kind of help you articulate what it is you feel you need can be enormously useful.
Yeah, I find that the challenges of junior staff can be sometimes hidden, and especially to those maybe above them. And I wanted to know what potential barriers, or personal or professional, do you think might be impacting our junior level women from reaching higher levels of leadership at UC campuses, and kind of bouncing off of what you've just described, how we can help those women and junior level staff get to the next level?
I think one thing we can look at very carefully is the work that they're given and assigned. I think that takes, I think if we start to think a little bit more conscientiously and deliberately and really examine, who gets the interesting, challenging things versus who gets the routine, not particularly aspirational, goal-stretching tasks. That's something, I myself have become aware of, who's tasked with sort of the, fixing the problem versus, imagining all the solutions. So thinking about how work gets allocated and how it's distributed in ways that help ensure an equal distribution of opportunity and challenge. Thinking about who needs support, looking at that problem of, are you making decisions around individuals' abilities based on their potential or their past performance? How often do you think, well, I don't know if so-and-so can do this because the last time they did it, it didn't work out. Versus really thinking about, well, maybe why didn't it work out? I can remember being in a position many years ago when, my boss told me that I needed to prove that I could do the job. And I thought, well, why did you hire me then? To hire me into a job and then tell me I have to prove myself to stay there, doesn't seem like a job. It seems like a test. So I think really thinking about how we assign work, how we allocate work, and what are our expectations and preconceptions about people's abilities and what are they based on, and just creating, taking kind of the time to examine one's assumptions is a management habit. I think it would be wise for us to cultivate.
Great. Well, we have time for just a few more questions here. And one question we have is there a movement in the UC towards a sponsorship program for women?
I don't know, although I know that there are a number of different initiatives and communities. And I am recollecting of a new program that has just come out, kind of modeled on the Cora program, I believe. And I think in the UC, unlike many other environments, we are much more inclined to, address these challenges either programmatically or certainly to create awareness around it. I think that it is important as women too to kind of go out and find these opportunities, and really, that's the part of taking responsibility for your own achievements and success by looking for the right programs, whether they're in the UC or not, and kind of crafting a professional development plan that you can seek support on, in order to get the skills and experience and exposure, or to get to build that cohort. I think, in fact, in some ways, doing that outside of the UC may have offer benefits because you get kind of a broader perspective.
I completely agree with you on that. And in that vein, I would encourage anybody, if they find any good training opportunities, to please share them with our Women in Tech Slack channel, so that all of us can benefit from any good learning that you're coming across. So.
I mean, one thing, maybe the group can create an inventory. It'd be great to have kind of just a list of all the things UC-wide, statewide, nationally, globally, that are cohort groups and opportunities for women to engage and get involved.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one last question here, Ann. You've been so great with giving us so much of your time. The last question is, picking your battles is important. Do you have suggestions about how to forgive or get past wrongdoings in a productive way?
Well, there's always wine. It's different for everybody. And I think part of it is you have to kind of face like the fact that you're angry and disappointed and annoyed, and you need someone to talk to about it. You need to voice it. I mean, I think the worst thing is always kind of keeping these things internally and sublimating them. Now, whether you're talking about that, with your husband or your best friend or your dog or your mother, or, I don't think it matters. But I think you have to keep a perspective. And as, I think looking at that speech, that recognition speech by Dana Boyd is important because, I've thought myself, I have had mentors in my career who are men, who have perpetuated a lot of the things that in this presentation I identify as problematic. And I've had to sort of reconcile the fact that I appreciate what they've done for me, or I forgive them, with the fact that, they too are subject to the same sort of systemic and structural biases and forces. So, short of behavior that's criminal, in which case I think then you have to take action on a matter of principle, then I think you have to remember, we're all human and we all make mistakes, and how do I approach this in a way that is going to preserve my strength and capacity to move forward in a productive way.
Well, I think that's very well said, Ann, and I completely agree with you. I just wanted to really thank you for all your insights in this really fantastic webinar that you've put together for the Women in Tech community and the UC community at large. I think there's a lot of fantastic takeaways here and actionable items that I know that I'm going to bring back to my groups and the people that I know and work with. And I hope that everybody else was able to find insights that they can use in their daily life as well. I wanted to let everybody know that we are doing a quick survey just to see what your feedback from the webinar. And we're also always soliciting ideas for future webinars, blog posts, any other ways that we can engage with our community. We would love to get as much involvement as possible. Please remember to join our Women in Tech Slack channel, and we will be moving forward probably in the spring with another webinar for Women in Tech, and keep your eye out on the blog for that. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining. And
I want thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed putting this together, and I hope it was useful and gave folks something to think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a good Tuesday. Thank you.
Bye-bye.